The Beginner's Guide is an interactive storytelling video game created by Davey Wreden under the studio name Everything Unlimited Limited. The game was released for Linux, OS X, and Windows on October 1, 2015. The game is Wreden's follow-up to the critically praised The Stanley Parable, his previous interactive storytelling title that was initially released in 2013. The game is narrated by Wreden and takes the user through a number of incomplete and abstract game creations made by a developer named Coda. Wreden challenges the player to try to come to understand the type of person Coda is from exploring these spaces in a first-person perspective. Wreden has stated the game is open to interpretation. Some have seen the game as a general commentary on the nature of the relationship between game developers and players, while others have taken it as an allegory to Wreden's own personal struggles with success resulting from the Stanley Parable. When the game sold, a reviewer, at least one, but I can't find records of more than that, made a bit of a stir by suggesting that the fiction presented in the game is true, and that therefore the game was built out of stolen material, and gamers buying it could hypothetically get it refunded if they felt that they were in any kind of moral quandary. This is, as best as I can understand it, the story of The Beginner's Guide, the entity in media, the confluence of reporting and reactions to a game. And now, in that same disjointed way of The Beginner's Guide, I want to tell you about Simone. Simone, stylized however you wanna, is a 2002 Al Pacino movie about a dude who creates a virtual actress. That's not even how the movie goes in full, it's way more involved than that, and it includes bestiality, and it has this nasty kind of undercurrent about the fundamentally exploitable nature of women in media spaces. It's an interesting film. I didn't say good. Anyway, the thing is, Simone's central premise is the virtual actress Simone. In movie, she doesn't exist. To reinforce this, she isn't credited as having an actress. The movie does do an extensive CGI sequence showing Simone being constructed digitally, but it was, let's say it was very 2002 and leave it at that. However, because she was uncredited, a bunch of people, including representatives from the Screen Actors Guild, believed that she was digitally created, and they started a fuss about it. I think. It's hard to find good sources about it now, but I remember a fuss. And so does TV tropes. I mean, it stands to reason. If you're a union, you want to oppose things that hurt the interest of your members, and that's a perfectly valid concern to be worried about around about now, with things like deep learning technology allowing us to transplant faces and details across multiple media works, and the complex relationships between motion capture and voice actor and fully integrated action. Like, if you weren't aware, motion captured faces are not a one-to-one acting thing. They're a structure for animators to work from. Gollum is not Andy Serkis is amazing. They're Andy Serkis and the 50 people doing all the rest of the work are amazing. And yes, Andy's ability to disappear into the role and do the physical acting element is impressive. That's a real conversation. But it's not the conversation they were having in 2002. There were some people in late 2002 who genuinely thought that Al Pacino movie with Winona Ryder on a budget of $10 million had successfully replicated the human form with complete authenticity digitally, and that the much cheaper and easy attack of just using an actor wasn't more likely. Then they thought it involved, an extensive plot about having sex with a pig. Simone was played by a Canadian actress, and the movie otherwise glanced over its very interesting questions of identity and artificiality and technology to instead tell a story about a dude who was very, very anxious about his inability to control women. The real story of the movie then is less about what the movie wanted to talk about, and much more about the fact that some people couldn't tell where the movie was fiction and where it was fact. The boundary of the diegesis confused people, and there were some critics who were genuinely unsure of how confident they could be about dismissing the fears of people who thought the end of actors had come. This comparison is because, while it's kind of stupid that video game criticism was duped into believing that maybe an author stole all their work and then recorded themselves having a nervous breakdown, then edited that nervous breakdown and cleaned up the audio and packaged it up and sold it on Steam without at any point considering that the art was stolen. It's not like video games are unique in this regard. We have a history of people not knowing the boundary between art and real, and sometimes, when people play with that, especially in areas of new technology, people make mistakes. But also, we are now living in a time when the joke of someone tried to sell entirely stolen assets on Steam for $15 isn't even a joke or a punchline. It might as well just be a fact of a thing that happens regularly and I just don't know about it. As a game experience, The Beginner's Guide is fine. I like it as a game because it needs the medium of games to make sense, complete with the idea of incomplete games and the way that games are not made from a coherent single point, but sort of constantly exploding sets of interconnected steps. You couldn't make this as a book because this isn't how a book would look when you're exploring its dismantled bits. The Beginner's Guide, if it were a book about books and making books, would look like a collected pile of paper in different hands and with a sort of formalizing editorial voice overall with some sticky notes on the paper. Funnily enough, it would look a bit like the Book of Genesis. Yeah, there's a long reach of an academic poke. It's a perfectly interesting work, in my mind, about imposter syndrome and emotional boundaries and creative processes and a lot of other things you can see in your own ink blots. It's an artistic piece that tells you a narrative in a really blunt way, but it uses its framing to create a blurred diegesis. It uses real-world markers to confuse you about the actuality of its narrative. Or it did at the time. There's a forking challenge here. On the one hand, I want to berate video games as a culture for being so woefully ill-equipped to deal with meta-art as to be convinced that the narrative presented in the beginner's guide was actually real, and have at least one actual journalist be so unsure of the reality of the presented narrative as to hedge their bets and mention seemingly unironically that refunds for this game were an option. On the other hand, it's not like we're drowning in meta-aware fiction in a cultural discourse that can treat this kind of thing seriously without one of them being seen as the correct way to do it. Since the Stanley Parable and then Beginner's Guide, the most recent big, oh everyone talks about it, meta game in my space has been Undertale, and I hated that. Since the Beginner's Guide's original appearance, things have moved on a bit, and particularly the word parasocial has fallen to the common voice. People with platforms use the term to describe the behavior of people who don't have platforms, and the people without platforms follow their word and its usage, and now parasocial has a sort of loose use around it, the idea that it's pretty much just anything that annoys you about other people on the internet, especially if they're talking about media you like. Then we got plagiarism, which is, I understand, mostly vibes. I want to compare Davey Wreden to Fred Gallagher, the author of Megatokyo. Megatokyo, if you're not familiar with it, is a webcomic that started in August 2000 and has never officially stopped updating since. It's updated twice this year, which puts it ahead of the same time last year. What Megatokyo is about is not important here. What is that Megatokyo was enormously successful, incredibly popular, and has never once had an update schedule its authors were happy with. I wrote a very long-form article about Megatokyo last year, and I still think that it's worth restructuring and presenting in some kind of long-form read way. In the end, my conclusion about it is that I don't think ill of Fred Gallagher as a creative, as much as I think that he got to suffer a unique kind of problem that only capitalism can cause, where you can be too successful to handle your own success. That is, both Wreden and Gallagher made something that led people to have assumptions and expectations that don't make any sense because the value of what they created was associated with capital, which is to say, the thing you need for money and rent and food. There's this idea we're all circling right now on a platform that is probably by now mostly procedurally generated, not just the stuff made in the past few years by tools like ChatGPT and the Midjourney thumbnails and all, but rather that the algorithm of YouTube made a lot of people make media in a way that shaved the non-formulaic parts off it, until there was nothing but hashtag content. The stuff you like is a small egg floating on a vast and turbulent sea of piss. It's now that people care a lot about a kind of authenticity from work, which separates from what I'm now going to call generative media, and which other people are going to insist on calling AI. The conversation around generative media is a real struggle sometimes because it feels like sometimes when people are talking about AI art bros, they're dealing with a very small pool of very obnoxious people, and sometimes I can even tell the specific dickhead they mean. It's shad. It's so often people mean shad. And yeah, sure, shad sucks. But the conversation around generative media is so often structured in these really weird ways that seem to imply low-quality images don't exist until generative media gets involved. That nobody cranks out bullshit, or that art is a transferable property of a human agent, or that in the great days of the internet, nobody's using pictures they didn't draw to illustrate articles they wrote. It's the kind of mindset that doesn't like Fountain, but also doesn't like corporate art, trying to argue that generative art is somehow the same thing. In this very video, I'm using gameplay footage from a game I don't own, and the reason you're not seeing the footage from Simone to reinforce when I talked about that movie is because if I did, a robot would get mad at me and block the video. I'm even in a defensive crouch saying this stuff here. Look, I think generative media tools have applications, particularly in zero-value situations. Nobody in the world is having their pocket picked if I copy art of Rin Matsuoka and use that for my D&D character. Similarly, someone with less image editing skill than mine using generative media to generate pictures of things they weren't going to pay for in the first place are not hurting anyone unless you believe in a literal cosmic value of these things. In that case, You're basically just like the generative media people who are functionally praying to ChatGPT. If you're rapid prototyping, if you're making a game and you need temporary assets to give yourself tools to build around, if you need a PowerPoint presentation for class, all of this stuff represents no lost value. This is a perfect place to put generative media. I'm sure purists will disagree, and I just don't care. But there's my stance. Generative media is an interesting toy that should be used as such, and if it can replace your job probably sucks, and you should be doing something cooler and better that people value more. That's a problem with jobs, and how we give people money to feed themselves, not the software that generates anime titty on demand, or the people who want to spend their time drawing anime titty. This is, I know, stupidly leftist, but the point is, I don't think it's good that artists have to be afraid of starving if the job opportunities around them are changed by automation systems. Now here is where things get all tangled up. It seems to me that most generative media is being attacked right now by people I generally like and agree with on most things because of very high concept, sometimes seemingly contradictory positions. People who dislike copyright law busting it out to attack Midjourney, and people who hate Disney praying for them to win a fight against Google. Ideas about the inherent nobility of art and stick figure illustrations being better than generative media on websites dedicated to sharing unsourced artworks of definitely not stick figures. People don't have reasons that make a lot of sense for why these things should not be tolerated, but they are very real about their emotional hatred of them. Which, given the people who defend generative media, makes sense. A lot of those people suck and are incredibly obnoxious. Particularly, it seems a lot of them are the losers of the NFT wave who are trying to get in at ground level as prompt engineers, as if the ecosystem they're entering will value them at all. One of the most sterling arguments against generative media, and one I personally like, is the idea that the tools represent potential precarity for artists who are already struggling to pay for things like, again, rent and food. Potential in that largely commission-based artistic survival under capitalism seems to be a bit of a dice roll as it is. My solution to this is not to shame people who weren't going to pay for art in the first place for failing to support a commission economy. Rather, it's things like massive overhauls of income inequality and universal basic income. The problem is my idea is hard and not likely to happen, and yelling at strangers in hyperbolic language is really easy. The pressure that created the beginner's guide is also the pressure that meant someone talking about an artistic work of anxiety media couched it in terms of fucking refunds, so that people didn't feel that they'd ethically misstepped by buying fiction about exploitation, a thing that nobody otherwise does. And it's the same pressure that means someone is making cheap, bad art with an exploitative method is a threat to the livelihood of a small number of people who have managed to make extremely precarious livings doing art in the first place. As if money is why artists make art, as if we aren't all struggling in exploitative systems, as if the existence of bland corporate art pumped out in huge troves to pad resume drawers isn't a thing we already have to deal with being everywhere. Since these past few years, writing academically, a habit I've gotten into is always trying to attribute where I got ideas from. Sentences that are referring to someone else's idea with their little note of, hey, this is that person at this date. It's a thing that can create the habit of also starting sentences with like, Reedon says this, or Gallagher's work shows this, which creates in casual conversation at least, an impression of a very specific kind of authorial access. Certainly, here on YouTube, I don't want to give you the impression because I'm pointing to their work that I can tell you what they think or feel. The idea that I can connect to these authors through a particularly big-brained reading of their work is similar to how Christians think that they can read God's mind because they read the book of Daniel. And, like in my case, Fred Gallagher at least exists. I don't know what Davey Reedon was thinking about the beginner's guide when he made it. Even if I asked him now, I won't get an answer. I'll get the answer of what he remembers of what he was thinking, which may be the same thing but can't necessarily be. I can try, and that's a way to get this authenticity, but it's not a way to guarantee it. The beginner's guide is still an interesting game to me because the conversation around it and around the ownership of work and of unsourced material and exploiting artists hasn't changed all that much, but all the people engaging in it have gotten new things to have to try and incorporate into their models. We are no closer to Coda. Also, the opening paragraphs of this article are just me reading from Wikipedia.